The air in the shattered docks tasted like a copper cent piece dipped in industrial solvent. It was the kind of atmosphere that didn't just sit in your lungs, it staked a claim. I was hunched over a leaking coolant manifold, my haptic sight implant humming a low, vibrating warning against my optic nerve. The metal was screaming in the infrared spectrum, brittle and ready to snap. "Thorne, you in there?" The voice came through the shop's rusted intercom, crackling with the weight of 20 years of neglected wiring. It was Silas, the dockmaster. He sounded more stressed than a load-bearing pillar in a gravity squall. "Jax Thorne, pick up the damn comm. We've got a live one in Bay 99. Emergency distress ping, high frequency, encrypted." I didn't let go of the manifold. If I did, the pressure would blow, and the shop would be knee-deep in radioactive sludge by midnight. I used my shoulder to toggle the response. "Unless they're paying in untainted oxygen or solid-state batteries, tell them to drift, Silas. I'm in the middle of a delicate surgery here. They're already in the berth, Thorne. The ship is bleeding ether fumes, and the pilot looks like she's about to start pulling her hair out. Move your ass. This isn't a suggestion." I grunted, finished the weld with a localized pulse viner, and watched the biometal knit together like a scab. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold for another 50,000 kilometers. I wiped my hands on a rag that was more grease than fibers and grabbed my tool chest. Bay 99 was located at the very edge of Ouroboros 9, a place where the station's gravity plating was more of a polite suggestion than a law. Walking there felt like being perpetually drunk on a tilting floor. The lighting was a flickering orange, struggling to illuminate the corridors that were literally built out of the calcified bone of whatever Leviathan had died here eons ago. When I reached the bay, I didn't see the pilot first. I saw the ship. It was a Vesper-class Wraith cutter, obsidian glass hull, whisper-quiet engines, and enough aerodynamic curves to make a physicist weep. It looked like a drop of ink suspended in the grimy air of the docks. But the ink was cracked. The main drive housing was warped, glowing with a sickly violet heat that suggested a core destabilization was 5 minutes away from turning this entire sector into a cloud of glowing dust. I set my chest down and finally looked at the pilot. She was standing by an open access panel, holding a diagnostic tablet like it was a live snake. She had the tapered ears of a hegemony elite, her skin pale and etched with faint, glowing lines of bioluminescent ink that mapped her nervous system. She wore traveling leathers that looked simple but moved with a fluid silkiness that screamed high credits. "You the mechanic?" she asked. Her voice wasn't shaky, but it had a sharp, brittle edge, like frozen glass. "I'm the guy who's going to charge you double for bringing a ticking bomb into my bay," I said, not looking at her eyes. I kept my gaze on the drive housing. "You're redlining at 12,000 degrees, lady. If you haven't vented the secondary capacitors in the last 10 seconds, we're all about to meet the void." "I don't know how to vent them," she snapped. The automated systems flatlined during the jump. I barely managed to kick the manual release on the docking clamps. I didn't wait for an invitation. I slid under the hull, the heat from the drive core singing the hair on my forearms. My haptic sight flared, painting the interior of the ship in a kaleidoscope of stress patterns. It was a mess. The ether couplings had fractured under sustained overacceleration. "Hold this," I said, tossing her a heavy hyperspanner from my kit. She caught it with surprisingly good reflexes, though she looked at the grease on the handle with a momentary flicker of distaste. "What is this?" "A wrench. Use it to keep that pressure valve from spinning while I bypass the safeties. If you let go, the manifold will twist and we'll get a face full of scalding vapor. You got that?" She didn't argue. She knelt in the grime, her expensive leathers soaking up oil, and gripped the valve. She was stronger than she looked. I worked in silence for the next 40 minutes, my pulse-vining torch dancing across the shattered couplings. I had to fabricate an alignment bracket on the fly, using a scrap piece of titanium alloy I kept for emergencies. I didn't treat the ship with reverence. I swore at the design flaws and mocked the fancy-ass internal shielding that was clearly built for show, rather than the rough and tumble of the Velos Nebula. "Whoever engineered this thing was a total slicer," I muttered, tightening a bolt. "They prioritized aesthetics over structural integrity. It's like putting a tuxedo on a guy with a glass jaw." "It's one of the fastest ships in the quadrant," she countered, her voice muffled by the hull. Speed doesn't mean a damn thing if you're dead in the water because a 3-credit washer failed, I shot back. You push this thing any harder and you'll be a very fast, very expensive smear on a pulsar's surface. I slid out from under the craft, wiped my face, and held out my hand for the hyperspanner. She handed it back, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were amber, deep, and unusually calm for someone who had just escaped a hull breach. "You're very blunt, Jax Thorne," she said. "Truth is the only thing that doesn't rust out here," I replied. "Your drive is synchronized, but only barely. Keep it under 6,000 RPM until you find a real shipyard. I've patched the leaks, but that biometal scabbing is a temporary fix." "How much?" she asked, pulling up her wrist interface. 40 soul credits, I said. "That covers the alloy, the vining gel, and 2 hours of my life I'm never getting back." She paused, her fingers hovering over the interface. "Just 40? I was prepared to offer 5,000 for an emergency repair of this magnitude. I don't charge based on what you can afford, lady. I charge what the work is worth. 40 soul credits is a fair price for a patch job. Charging you 5,000 would make me a thief, and I'm a mechanic. There's a difference." She stared at me for a long beat, a strange expression crossing her face. Something like genuine wonder, or maybe she just thought I was the stupidest man in the galaxy. She transferred the 40 credits and a small bonus of 5 for the honest talk. I checked the account and nodded. "Good enough. Get your ship out of here before the dock master realizes I didn't report the radiation leak. He's a stickler for paperwork." "I'm Lyra," she said as she stepped onto her boarding ramp. "Jax," I replied, already packing my tools. "Try not to break my weld in the next 10 light years, Lyra. It would hurt my professional pride." She smiled then, a small, genuine thing that made the dingy bay feel slightly less like a tomb. "I suspect your pride is quite safe, Jax Thorne." I watched her go, the wraith cutter sliding out into the darkness of the nebula with the grace of a predator. I went back to my shop, thinking about the amber in her eyes and the way she hadn't flinched at the grease. She was a high-tier runaway, I decided. Maybe a CEO's daughter or a corporate spy. I made a cup of synthesized coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and sat at my bench, counting my 45 credits. It was enough for a week of real food and a new set of haptic sensors. Life was simple. Life was honest. That lasted for exactly 3 hours. I was halfway through a nap when the station's proximity alarm started howling. It wasn't the usual freighter bump alarm. This was the end of the world siren. I scrambled to the viewing port of my shop, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. The space outside Ouroboros 9, usually a dark expanse of violet gas and starlight, was gone. It had been replaced by gold. 3 Sun Eater-class dreadnoughts, each 5 kilometers of shimmering armor and heavy plasma batteries, had dropped out of jump space right on top of our docking ring. They bore the crest of the Vesperal hegemony, a rising sun over a broken crown. My comm system exploded. Silas was screaming so loud I had to move the headset away from my ear. "Thorne! Thorne, what the hell did you do? The Vesperal High Command is on the line. They're demanding to know the location of the master engineer who serviced the Sovereign's vessel." I looked at the gold-plated ships filling the sky and felt a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "I just fixed a drive coupling, Silas," I whispered to the empty room. That's all I did. Ouroboros 9 had never been a quiet station, but the silence that followed the arrival of the Vesperal fleet was deafening. It was the silence of 10,000 people holding their breath, waiting to see if they were about to be liberated or vaporized. I sat on my workbench, my boots dangling over the edge, watching the holographic feed from the station's external cameras. The dreadnoughts hadn't fired a single shot. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was a kinetic statement. They hovered like 3 vengeful gods, their golden hulls reflecting the pulsar's light in a way that made the station look like a rust-stained thumb in a jeweler's display. "Jax, you've got to go up there." Silas's voice crackled again, sounding significantly more sober. He was in my shop now, physically leaning against the doorframe, his face the color of unwashed linen. "Up where, Silas?" "To the flagship?" I asked, reaching for my coffee. It was cold. "They've sent a shuttle to Bay 1, not Bay 99. Bay 1, the executive berth. The one with the real carpet and the air that doesn't smell like a locker room. They asked for you by name. Jax Thorne. I'm not a diplomat, Silas. I'm a grease monkey. If they're looking for someone to bow and scrape, they've got the wrong guy. They're not looking for bowing, Silas hissed, grabbing my arm. They're looking for the man who saved the Queen's life. The Queen, Jax. You worked on the Sovereign's personal transport. You told the ruler of 6 star systems that her ship was a shiny toy and her engineers were slicers. I felt a ghost of a grin pull at my lips. To be fair, I was right. The drive coupling was a joke. Silas didn't find it funny. He practically dragged me toward the elevator. I didn't change my clothes. I was still wearing my oil-stained coveralls with the patch on the left knee that was currently held together by 2 staples and a prayer. My hands were still stained with the violet residue of ether coolant. If they wanted the mechanic, they were getting the mechanic. Bay 1 was a different world. The air was pressurized to a perfect 22 degrees Celsius, scented with something that smelled like actual pine trees from old Earth. A squad of Vesperal guards stood in 2 rows, their armor a matte white composite that made them look like statues. At the end of the row stood Chancellor Malachor, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a very expensive piece of mahogany and then dressed in velvet. Mr. Thorne, he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that made my chest vibrate. I am Chancellor Malachor. On behalf of the Vesperal hegemony, I welcome you. I stopped 10 paces away, my tool chest still gripped in my right hand. I didn't bow. I just nodded. Chancellor, nice ships. Hope they have better manifolds than the little one. The Chancellor's expression didn't flicker, but I saw a guard in the back row shift his weight. A breach of protocol, I assumed. Her Majesty, Queen Seraphine, has informed us of your unique service, Malachor continued. She spoke of your technical brilliance and your remarkable lack of self-interest. You saved the sovereign of the hegemony from a core collapse that would have claimed not only her life, but the lives of 500 crew members on the nearby diplomatic station. She didn't mention the crew, I muttered. She said she wanted anonymity. Anonymity is a luxury sovereigns rarely achieve, Mr. Thorne. However, your integrity has earned you a debt that the hegemony is eager to repay. He gestured to an official-looking woman who stepped forward with a data slate. As a gesture of our profound gratitude, the hegemony has authorized the following: a transfer of 10 billion soul credits to an account of your choosing, the title of Grand Engineer of the Vesperal Court, land holdings on the paradise world of Ethelgard, totaling 300,000 hectares, and a lifetime exemption from all interstellar tariffs. The numbers were so large they didn't even register as money. They felt like coordinates to a different galaxy. I could buy Ouroboros 9. I could buy 10 Ouroboros 9s and turn them into private museums for broken wrenches. I looked at the data slate, then at the Chancellor's expectant face. He looked like a man who had just offered a dog a steak and was waiting for it to wag its tail. No, I said. The silence returned, heavier than before. Malachor blinked, a genuine crack in his polished facade. I beg your pardon? I said no. I don't want the credits. I don't want the title. And I sure as hell don't want to live on a paradise world where everyone wears white armor and talks like they're reciting poetry. Mr. Thorne, Malachor said, his voice dropping an octave, perhaps you don't understand the magnitude of— I understand fine, I interrupted, setting my tool chest down with a heavy thud. I told your queen the price. It was 40 soul credits. She paid it. We're square. 40 credits for a sovereign's life is an insult to the hegemony, Malachor snapped, his patience finally fraying. 40 credits is what the work was worth, I shot back, stepping into his personal space. If I take 10 billion for the same job, then my work doesn't have a value anymore. It just has a bribe price. I don't work for bribes, I work for fair pay. If you want to honor me, respect my rate. Malachor stared at me, and for a second I thought I'd pushed too far. I saw his hand twitch toward the calm bead at his throat. He looked at my stained clothes, my scarred hands, and the stubborn set of my jaw. Then the shuttle doors behind him hissed open. Lyra stepped out. Or Queen Seraphine, I guess. She wasn't in leathers anymore. She was wearing a gown made of woven starlight, her hair crown braided with obsidian pins. She looked ancient and powerful and impossibly distant. But when she saw me, her amber eyes softened. She looked at the Chancellor, then at me. "He refused, didn't he?" she asked. Malachor bowed low. "He is difficult, Majesty. He insists on his standard rate." Seraphine walked toward me, her guards parting like a curtain. She stopped 3 feet away. The smell of pine followed her. "You told me truth was the only thing that didn't rust, Jax," she said softly. "It is," I replied. "And the truth is, I'm a mechanic on Ouroboros 9. I like my shop. I like my autonomy. If I take your billions, I'm just another asset on your balance sheet. I'd rather be the guy who fixed your ship because it was broken, not because you're a queen." She studied me, her bioluminescent tattoos pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. She wasn't offended. She was smiling. "He stays," she said, turning to Malachor. "Cancel the transfer. Rescind the titles." "But Majesty," Malachor began, "he has given me something far more valuable than a technical repair, Chancellor. He has given me proof that my empire has not yet hollowed out the souls of its subjects. He has kept his integrity in a galaxy where everything is for sale." She turned back to me. "But Jax, you said 40 soul credits was for the repair. You never charged me for the conversation." "That was free," I said, feeling a flush creep up my neck. "I enjoyed the talk." "Then I shall consider that a debt in my favor," she said. "I will pass through this sector again in 1 month. I expect my drive coupling to be inspected, and I expect to hear your opinion on the latest infrastructure proposals for this station." "I don't do policy," I warned. "You do systems," she countered, "and this station is just a very large, very broken system." She leaned in, her voice a whisper for me alone. "Keep your shop, Jax Thorne. Keep your integrity. But don't think for a second I'm done with you. A man who can't be bought is the only man a queen can truly trust." She stepped back onto the shuttle, the doors closing with a hiss of pressurized air. The golden dreadnoughts began to glow as their jump drives engaged. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving behind nothing but a fading wake of light and a very confused Chancellor standing on the dock. I picked up my tool chest and looked at Silas, who was still frozen in the corner. "You're a dead man, Thorne," Silas whispered. "You just turned down a galaxy." I looked at my hands still stained with oil, and then at the 45 credits in my account. I felt lighter than I had in years. "Nah, Silas," I said, turning back toward the elevator. "I just kept my job." I walked back to my shop, thinking about the month ahead. I needed to fix that coffee maker. If a queen was coming back for a visit, the least I could do was offer her a cup that didn't taste like a chemical spill. Integrity is a hell of a thing. It doesn't pay for dreadnoughts, but it sure as hell makes for a good night's sleep. I reached my door, toggled the lock, and got back to work. There was a radiator on deck 7 that was making a noise like a dying bird, and it wasn't going to fix itself. The thing about refusing 10 billion soul credits is that people don't just pat you on the back and call you a hero. They treat you like you've caught a highly infectious case of terminal stupidity. For the 30 days following the departure of the Vesperal fleet, my shop was less of a repair bay and more of a pilgrimage site for every grifter, corporate scout, and local lowlife within 5 light years. I was sitting at my bench, the haptic sight implant behind my left ear, pulsing with a dull, rhythmic throb. Before me lay the dissected remains of a pulsar filter, a delicate mesh of silver wire and crystallized gas designed to keep the station's occupants from being slow-cooked by the dying star we orbited. It was a high-precision job, the kind that required a steady hand and a mind clear of distractions. Naturally, the intercom chose that exact moment to scream, "Jax, you've got a visitor. Another one. Claims he's with the Ethel Mining Syndicate." Silas's voice crackled through the speaker. He sounded exhausted. Ever since the Queen's visit, he'd been acting as a reluctant gatekeeper, a job that mostly involved me shouting at him to tell people to drift into the void. "Tell him I don't do business with slicers who wear 3,000 credit suits to a scrap Hulk station," I muttered, my soldering iron dancing over a microscopic fracture in the filter's housing. "He's offering 500 credits just for an introductory meeting, Jax. Just 10 minutes of your time." 500 credits? I paused, the blue tip of the iron hovering a hair's breadth above the mesh. Tell him to leave the credits with you as a donation to the station's oxygen scrubber fund, and then kick him toward the airlocks. I'm busy fixing the air he's currently wasting." I heard a muffled argument on the other side of the comm, followed by the satisfying sound of a heavy door slamming shut. Silas sighed, a long, weary noise that made the speakers hiss. "You can't keep this up, Thorne. Half the station thinks you're hiding a royal secret, and the other half is convinced you've got a direct line to the Vesperal throne. They don't want their ships fixed. They want a piece of whatever luck you're holding on to." "It wasn't luck, Silas. It was a drive coupling. Now let me work." I cut the comm and leaned back, rubbing my eyes. The shop felt smaller than usual. The shelves were still stacked with salvaged components, and the floor still bore the scars of 1,000 chemical spills, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was heavy with the weight of unearned expectations. People looked at my oil-stained coveralls and saw a man wearing a golden cloak they couldn't quite see. It made my skin crawl. Integrity is a great shield, but it makes for a hell of a target. I was reaching for my coffee, which, true to my promise, I had upgraded to a blend that only tasted 50% like industrial runoff, when the bay door hissed open. I didn't look up. "If you're here to offer me a moon, a title, or a seat on a board of directors, the exit is behind you. If your ship is broken, leave the diagnostic logs on the counter and come back in 3 days." "I was hoping for a more immediate inspection," a voice said. The soldering iron nearly slipped from my fingers. I knew that voice. It was refined, melodic, and currently stripped of the regal distance I'd heard on the executive dock. It sounded like the woman who had knelt in the grease of Bay 99 and asked what a wrench was for. I turned slowly. Standing at the threshold was a traveler. She wore a heavy hooded cloak made of drab, sensor-reflective fabric, the kind of thing a mid-tier smuggler or a cautious ghost tech would wear to blend into the shadows of a station like Ouroboros 9. Her face was partially obscured, but the glint of amber eyes was unmistakable. "Lyra," I said, the name feeling familiar and dangerous all at once. "Jax," she replied, stepping into the shop and toggling the door lock behind her. She pulled back the hood, revealing her blonde braid and those tapered ears. She looked tired, the faint bioluminescent tattoos on her neck flickering with an erratic, low-voltage pulse. "You haven't changed the shop." "Hard to change perfection," I grunted, setting the pulsar filter aside. "What are you doing here? And where are the 5-kilometer-long dreadnoughts? I figured you didn't go anywhere without a small sun's worth of firepower backing you up." She walked over to my workbench, her fingers tracing the edge of my tool chest. "I'm traveling under a blackout protocol. Officially, I'm in a stasis meditation on Vesper Prime. Unofficially, I needed to see if the only man who tells me the truth was still alive, or if the vultures had picked him clean." "They're trying," I said, gesturing to the closed door. "The station is crawling with people who think my integrity is just a high-concept negotiation tactic. They're waiting for me to name my price." "And have you?" "Price hasn't changed. 40 soul credits for the work. Conversations are still free, though I might start charging for the headache you're bringing with you." Lyra laughed, a soft, genuine sound that cut through the mechanical hum of the room. It felt out of place here, like a flower growing in a fuel tank. She settled onto her claimed cargo container, the one I hadn't moved since her last visit. "My engineers are still arguing about that alignment bracket you fabricated," she said. "One of them insisted it violated 3 laws of structural harmonics. He wanted to replace it with a standard Vesperal issue unit." I bristled. "And did you let him?" "No. I told him that if he touched your weld, I'd have him reassigned to a waste reclamation plant on the outer moons. I trust the man who knows how systems actually scream over the man who only reads the blueprints." "Good call. Your engineers are slicers," I said, finally allowing myself a small grin. "So, you're here for an inspection? Or did you just come back to see how the poor people live?" Her expression sobered instantly. The playfulness vanished, replaced by the sharp, analytical gaze of a sovereign. "I came because Ouroboros 9 is failing, Jax, and I don't think it's just decay." I frowned, my haptic sight humming as it picked up the ambient vibrations of the station. Ouroboros 9 was old, sure. It was built inside the skull of a dead space beast, held together by ancient rivets and modern prayers. But it had a rhythm, a heartbeat. Failing how? I asked. The hegemony has been receiving reports of microfluctuations in the pulsar's gravity well. This station should be compensating, but the telemetry is lagging. If the station's structural integrity fields don't adjust within the next 48 hours, the tidal forces will start peeling the hull away like dead skin. I stood up, my mind already racing through the station's schematics. The main compensators are on deck 50. They're managed by the administrative board. If they're lagging, it's a maintenance issue. Silas and the others are probably just behind schedule. It's more than that, Lyra said, standing to join me. I ran a silent diagnostic on the station's external grid as I approached. Someone has installed a ghost loop in the power flow. It's bleeding 30% of the structural energy into the void. It's not an accident, Jax. It's sabotage. I felt a cold prickle of sweat on the back of my neck. Sabotage on a station with 10,000 people was a death sentence. If the gravity well caught us and the fields were weak, we wouldn't just drift. We'd be crushed into a singularity the size of a marble. Who would want to tank this station? I muttered. We're a scrap heap. There's no strategic value here. There is if you want to buy the mineral rights to the pulsar once the pesky inhabitants are gone, Lyra noted. Or if you want to humiliate the queen, who recently showed an unusual interest in a backwater mechanic. I looked at her, the realization sinking in. You think this is about me? Or rather, about you and me? I think people like Chancellor Malachor don't like being told no. And they especially don't like it when the person saying it is a man they can't control. If Ouroboros 9 fails while I'm associated with it, it proves that my judgment is flawed. It forces me back into the fold of calculated diplomacy. I grab my heavy-duty toolkit and a pulse viner. If you're right, the ghost loop won't be in the main bays. It'll be in the guts. The areas where the biological bone meets the mechanical supports. Nobody goes down there except the maintenance droids, and half of those are rusted shut. Then we go together, Lyra said. No way, you're a queen. You stay here in the shop. It's the most defensible spot on this deck. Jax Thorne, she said, her voice dropping into that tone of absolute command that reminded me she ruled star systems. I spent 6 hours watching you work. I know where the pressure valves are. I know how to use that hyperspanner, and I have access codes that will get us through the security firewalls that would take you hours to crack. You need the engineer, not the sovereign. Now, are we going to fix this, or are we going to keep arguing until the gravity well turns us into a pancake? I stared at her for a beat, then sighed. Fine, but you're carrying the secondary batteries. And if we run into trouble, you do what I say. No royal protocols, no off with their heads. Just scrap Hulk logic. Deal, she said, a flash of excitement crossing her face. We were halfway to the service hatch in the back of my shop when the lights flickered. A sickening, deep red pulse that signaled a Tier 1 system strain. The floor beneath our feet groaned, a low-frequency vibration that my haptic sight translated as a structural shear point forming somewhere on Deck 12. It's starting, I said, kicking the hatch open. A sudden, sharp hiss of escaping gas filled the shop, but it wasn't coming from the station's pipes. A small, spherical drone, painted the matte black of corporate covert ops, had drifted through the open bay door. It whistled, a high-pitched sound that signaled a target lock. Get down! I lunged for Lyra, tackling her behind a stack of reinforced titanium crates, just as the drone unleashed a concentrated thermic lance. The beam sliced through my workbench, vaporizing the pulsar filter I'd been working on, and turning my favorite soldering iron into a puddle of molten silver. The heat was intense, the air smelling of ozone and ozone-charred wood. That was 1,000 credits worth of inventory, I yelled, reaching into my toolkit for a heavy-duty magnetic clench. I think your life is worth more, Lyra shouted back, pulling a small, elegant kinetic pistol from beneath her cloak. Debatable, I roared. I leaned out from the crates and hurled the magnetic clench with the precision of a man who had spent years throwing tools at stubborn engines. The device slapped onto the drone's side, its powerful magnets instantly shorting out the machine's propulsion fins. The drone wobbled, its lance beam carving a jagged scar across my ceiling before slamming into the floor with a dull thud. Lyra didn't hesitate. She stepped out and fired 2 precise shots into the drone's optical sensor, making sure it was well and truly dead. Corporate slicers, I spat, looking at my ruined workbench. That was personal. They know I'm here, Lyra said, her eyes scanning the shop. The ghost loop was the lure. The drone was the confirmation. We need to move, Jax. If there's one drone, there's a squad of specialists not far behind. I looked at the ruined shop, the place I'd built with 40 credit repairs and honest work. It was my cage, maybe, but it was mine. And seeing it burn because of a Game of Thrones I never asked to play made something hard and cold settle in my chest. Then we don't just find the ghost loop, I said, grabbing a plasma welder and strapping it to my hip like a sidearm. We find whoever's holding the remote, and we show them what happens when you break a mechanic's tools. I toggled the emergency seal on the shop, locking the drone inside. We dropped through the service hatch, leaving the light of the docks behind and descending into the dark, wet warmth of the station's guts. The air here was thicker, smelling of ancient marrow and recycled grease. Ouroboros 9 was screaming, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to fix it. The guts of Ouroboros 9 weren't meant for people. This was the interface layer, the place where the massive, calcified vertebrae of the Leviathan met the fusion conduits and gravity pylons of the human-built station. The walls were a sickening mix of white, porous bone and black, throbbing cables. It felt like being swallowed by a giant machine that was still halfway through its last meal. "Watch your step," I whispered, my haptic sight painting the world in shades of thermal blue and structural red. "The floor here is organic. If you put too much weight on a soft spot, you'll drop 20 levels into the waste reclamation vats. It's not a pretty way to go." Lyra was right behind me, her breathing steady despite the oppressive humidity. She was holding her kinetic pistol in a professional, low-ready position. I noticed her hand didn't shake. Most royals have people to do their shooting for them, but she handled the weapon like she'd spent time on a range. "The air recyclers are at 40% efficiency down here," she noted, her voice echoing off the curved bone walls. "The carbon scrubbers are saturated. We have maybe 6 hours of breathable atmosphere if the sabotaged flow continues." "Then we'd better find that ghost loop," I said. "The structural pylons are another 200 meters down. That's where the power bleed would be most effective. If you wanted to snap this station's neck, that's where you'd put the leverage." We moved in a tense silence. The only sound the distant rhythmic thud of the station's heart, the primary fusion reactor, and the occasional wet squelch of our boots on the organic floor. My haptic sight was picking up weird vibrations. Not the usual mechanical hum, but something sharper. Staccato bursts of energy that didn't belong in the station's ecosystem. "Someone's ahead of us," I breathed, pulling Lyra into the shadow of a massive, rib-like pillar. I peered around the bone. About 50 meters ahead, a team of 3 figures in high-end tactical gear were clustered around a primary pylon. They didn't look like station security. Their armor was matte gray, equipped with active camo panels that blurred their silhouettes against the grime. They were installing a series of devices that looked like glowing, violet leeches, energy siphoners. "Vesperal Special Ops," Lyra hissed, her amber eyes narrowing until they looked like slits. I recognized the gear configuration. Those are Sovereign's shadow units. They report directly to the Chancellor. "Your own people are trying to kill you, Lyra? That's cold even for an empire." "Not kill me," she whispered. "They probably assume I'm still on Vesper Prime. They're here to ensure the station accidentally fails. If I'm not here, it's just a tragic industrial disaster. If I am, well, dead queens don't argue with the official report." I looked at the specialists. They were professionals, meticulous. They were checking the pulse vining on the siphons, making sure the bleed was consistent with the station's natural decay. Total slicers, I thought, but the lethal kind. "What's the play, Jax? We can't take 3 trained assassins in a head-on fight, not with 1 pistol and a toolkit." I looked at the ceiling. Above the siphons ran a series of high-pressure steam conduits, byproducts of the station's cooling system. They were old, rusted, and held together by the same outdated adhesives I'd mocked earlier. "We don't need to fight them," I said, a plan forming in the messy, engineering-driven part of my brain. "We just need to break the system they're standing in. You see that red valve on the overhead line? The one with the pressure gauge that's currently in the red?" Lyra followed my gaze. "The primary coolant bypass? If you blow that, This whole corridor will be flooded with superheated vapor. Exactly. It won't kill them. Their armor will protect them for a minute or two, but they'll be blind. And the thermal bloom will mask our signatures. While they're busy trying not to get boiled, I'll drop down and yank those leeches off the pylon. And me? You cover the door. If any more of them show up, you make enough noise to give me a chance to bug out. I didn't wait for her approval. I started climbing a series of rusted rungs built into the Leviathan's rib. My haptic sight was screaming now, the heat from the steam conduits flaring bright white in my vision. I reached the valve, the metal so hot I could feel it through my insulated gloves. I looked down. The specialists were finishing their work. One of them tapped his comm bead. Siphon loop established. Commencing final bleed out on signal. Not today, Slicer, I muttered. I jammed a heavy pry bar into the valve handle and threw my entire weight against it. The rusted metal resisted for a heartbeat, then snapped with a sound like a gunshot. A jet of white-hot steam erupted from the conduit, expanding instantly into the corridor. The temperature jumped 40 degrees in seconds. I heard the specialists shouting, their voices muffled by the sudden roar of the vapor. I dropped from the rungs, my boots hitting the organic floor with a heavy thud. I was blind too, but my haptic sight didn't care about steam. I could see the glowing violet heat of the energy siphoners as clearly as stars in the void. I lunged for the pylon. The first lecherous device came off with a spray of sparks. I felt a sharp electrical jolt travel up my arm, numbing my fingers, but I didn't stop. I yanked the second one free, then the third. Movement! Target in the mist! Son, one of the specialists roared. A series of kinetic bolts hissed through the steam, one of them glancing off the pylon inches from my head. I scrambled backward, my lungs burning from the heat. Jax, this way! Lyra's voice was a beacon. I turned and ran toward the sound of her voice, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I burst through a cloud of vapor and found her standing by a heavy bulkhead door, her pistol leveled at the steam. She grabbed my collar and hauled me through the door, slamming the manual override. The thick metal door groaned into place, sealing the corridor. Did you get them? She gasped, her face flushed from the heat. I held up the 3 violet devices, their lights flickering and dying now that they were disconnected from the power flow. Got 'em. The structural fields should be stabilizing now. We just bought the station another 24 hours. We were in a small, cramped maintenance hub. It smelled of ozone and ancient dust. I slumped against the wall, my hands shaking as the adrenaline started to recede. I looked at Lyra. She was disheveled, her expensive cloak torn, her blonde hair escaping its braid. She looked less like a queen and more like a survivor. You're a hell of a mechanic, Jax Thorne, she said, leaning against the opposite wall. I'm a hell of a target, I corrected. Your people are going to come through that door in about 3 minutes once they realize their fancy toys are broken. No, she said, pulling a data slate from her belt. I've already initiated a localized comm jam. They can't report back to the Chancellor. For the next hour, they're just 3 guys lost in the steam. She looked at the energy siphoners in my hand. Do you know what these are, Jax? Truly? Expensive-looking batteries that bleed power? They're soul credit anchors, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. They don't just siphon energy. They encode it into currency. The Chancellor wasn't just trying to sabotage the station. He was literally turning the station's life force into profit. He was harvesting Ouroboros 9. I felt a surge of cold fury. I'd spent my life fixing things that people like the Chancellor broke. I'd seen the mining colonies where the soul credit system was born, where people traded hours of their biological life expectancy for the right to breathe. Is that what the hegemony is, Lyra? I asked, looking her in the eyes. A system that turns people's lives into line items on a ledger? Because if it is, I don't care how many star systems you rule. You're just a very high-tier slicer. Lyra didn't look away. The amber in her eyes flared with a mixture of shame and determination. That is what it has become, a machine that prioritizes the asset over the individual. My father built the hegemony on the idea of collective security, but the bureaucrats turned it into a market of souls. That's why I came back, Jax. I wanted to see if there was anyone left who understood that some things, like integrity, like the truth, don't have a credit value. And and I found a man who turned down 10 billion credits because it would change who he was. I found a man who risked his life to save a station that doesn't even know his name. You're the only non-devaluing currency I've found in 70 years, Jax. I didn't know what to say to that. Engineering I could handle. Physics was predictable. But a queen telling me I was her moral compass? That was a design flaw I didn't know how to repair. We're not out of this yet, I said, checking the charge on my plasma welder. The ghost loop is gone, but the station's main reactor is still redlining. The sabotage went deeper than the pylons. They've messed with the core harmonics. The floor groaned again, a deep, bone-rattling sound that vibrated through the Leviathan's skull. The red emergency lights in the maintenance hub died, replaced by a flickering emergency blue. The reactor, Lyra breathed, it's losing synchronization. If the reactor loses sync, the station doesn't just fail, I said. It becomes a miniature nova. 10,000 people, Lyra. All of them turned into starlight. Can you fix it? I looked at my hands. They were stained with grease, scarred by 100 small failures, and currently the only thing standing between Ouroboros 9 and oblivion. I can't fix a fusion reactor with a wrench and a prayer, Lyra. I need the control codes, the master overrides that are locked in the administrator's office. I have the codes, she said, stepping forward. But the office will be crawling with Chancellor Malicor's men. They'll be expecting us to head for the escape pods, not the command center. Then we do what we do best, I said, a grim smile pulling at my lips. We take the maintenance ducts. We move like ghosts through the systems they think they own. We're going to the top, Lyra. We're going to give the administrator a piece of our minds, and then we're going to save this scrap hulk. And then, she asked, and then you're going to pay me 40 credits for the consult. Standard rate. Lyra laughed, and for a moment, the dark, damp maintenance hub didn't feel so oppressive. She took my hand, a brief, firm grip of solidarity, and we started climbing. The station was dying, but the mechanic and the queen were still on the job. And as any good engineer knows, the most important part of any system isn't the power source or the shielding. It's the integrity of the connection. We crawled through the ventilation shafts of Deck 35, the air tasting of static and burnt wiring. Every few minutes, the station would shudder, a sickening lurch that told me the gravity well was winning. My haptic sight was a mess of warning lights, but I kept my focus on the thermal signature of the command spire. We're close, I whispered, looking through a vent grating into the luxury corridor of the administrative sector. The corridor was a stark contrast to the guts. Polished white stone, holographic waterfalls, and the smell of artificial jasmine. It was the place where the station's elite lived, blissfully unaware that their floors were about to become their ceilings. A squad of matte gray guards was positioned outside the administrator's office. They were alert, weapons ready. They weren't looking for a mechanic. They were looking for a threat they could understand. Wait here, I said to Lyra. Jax, what are you doing? I'm going to provide a technical distraction, I said, pulling a small pressurized canister of coolant lubricant from my kit. You use your codes to bypass the door once the room is clear. I tossed the canister down the ventilation shaft, followed by a small sparking electrical igniter. The explosion wasn't big, but it was loud and produced a massive cloud of thick black smoke that smelled like a tire fire. The luxury corridor's automated fire suppression systems kicked in instantly, drenching the guards in white, slippery foam and adding to the chaos. Intruders! Deck 35! The guard leader roared. They charged toward the source of the smoke, leaving the office door unguarded for a crucial 10 seconds. Now! I hissed. Lyra dropped from the vent with a grace I could only envy. She lunged for the door panel, her fingers flying across the interface. Override code, Seraphine Delta 903, she commanded. The heavy obsidian doors hissed open. We slipped inside just as the first kinetic bolts started hitting the stonework behind us. The office was vast, dominated by a panoramic window that showed the pulsar, a blinding, spinning eye of fire that looked far too close for comfort. At the desk sat the administrator, a man named Harlan, who looked like he'd been built out of jelly and expensive silk. He was staring at the reactor readouts with a look of paralyzing terror. "Harlan!" I yelled. He jumped, his eyes wide as he saw the disheveled mechanic and the cloaked woman. "Thorne? What are you doing here? The station is... We have to evacuate." You're not going anywhere, Harlan, Lyra said, throwing back her hood. The administrator's face went from pale to ghostly white. Majesty, I didn't know. The Chancellor said, The Chancellor lied to you, Harlan, Lyra said, her voice like a knife. He's harvesting your station. And if you don't give us the core synchronization codes right now, he's going to harvest you too. Harlan fumbled with a data slate, his hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped it. I don't have the codes. The Chancellor's team locked the system. They said it was for security. I didn't wait for the codes. I lunged for the primary console, my haptic sight flaring as I interfaced with the station's brain. It was a mess of encrypted loops and ghost commands. It was a puzzle designed to be unsolvable. But I wasn't an administrator. I was a mechanic. I knew that every system, no matter how complex, has a physical bypass, a solder point, a place where the logic stops and the physics begins. Lyra, I need you to boost my signal, I said, grabbing 2 power leads and holding them to my haptic implant. Use your wrist interface to flood the firewall with Vesperal Prime protocols. Make them think the Queen is demanding an audit. Jax, that will burn out your implant, she cried. The station is about to burn out 10,000 people. Just do it. I felt a surge of white-hot agony as Lyra initiated the bypass. My vision exploded into 1,000 shards of data. I could feel the reactor's vibration in my teeth, the gravity well pulling at my bones. I saw the ghost loop. It was a tiny, elegant piece of code hidden in the reactor's pulse timing. It was beautiful, in a sick, corporate way. It was a command to fail. I didn't try to hack it. I didn't have the time. Instead, I used my pulse-vining torch to physically weld the 2 primary data conduits together, bypassing the control unit entirely. Rapid, unplanned assembly, I roared through the pain. The console erupted in sparks, throwing me backward. The room shook with a final, violent jolt that sent Harlan's desk trinkets flying. Then silence. Not the silence of the void, but the deep, steady hum of a synchronized reactor. The floor stopped tilting. The red lights on the readouts turned a steady, calm green. I lay on the floor, my vision slowly returning. My left side felt like it had been hit by a freight train, and my implant was dead, but the air recyclers were humming. The heartbeat of Ouroboros 9 was back to a steady 72 beats per minute. Lyra knelt beside me, her hand on my shoulder. You fixed it, Jax. You really fixed it. Standard rate, I wheezed, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. 40 credits, plus maybe an extra 10 for the facial burn. Harlan was still staring at us, his mouth hanging open. Beyond the window, the golden dreadnoughts of the Vesperal hegemony were dropping out of jump space again. But this time, they weren't here to reward me. They were here for the Chancellor's men. Lyra stood, her silhouette framed by the dying star and the golden fleet. She looked powerful, yes. She looked like a queen. But when she looked down at me, I saw the person who'd knelt in the grease. The Chancellor is done, Jax, she said. But the system that created him, that's a much bigger repair job. One weld at a time, Lyra, I said, reaching out to take the hand she offered. One weld at a time. As she hauled me to my feet, I looked at the pulsar. It was still there, dangerous and beautiful. Just like the truth. Just like integrity. It doesn't make the world easy, but it makes the world work. And in a universe of slicers, that's the only victory that matters. The hum of the Vesperal dreadnought, the resplendent dawn, was nothing like the wheezing, asthmatic rattle of Ouroboros 9. On the station, you could feel every vibration of the atmospheric scrubbers in the soles of your boots. You learned to read the station's health by the rhythm of its clanging pipes. Here the deck plating felt like solid bedrock, and the air was so filtered it tasted of absolutely nothing. It was unnatural. A machine that didn't complain was a machine you couldn't trust, at least according to my haptic sight, which was currently giving me a headache the size of a small moon. I sat on the edge of a levitating medical bunk, my oil-stained coveralls a jagged, dark stain against the pristine white of the ship's infirmary. A medical droid, a sleek silver spindle that moved with a fluid grace that made me want to hit it with a heavy-duty hyperspanner, was scanning my left side. The thermal burns are superficial, Mr. Thorne, the droid stated in a voice that sounded like synthesized silk. However, your haptic sight implant has suffered a total sensory overload. The neural coupling is fractured in 24 places. I recommend immediate replacement with a Vesper Prime Grade A interface. Touch my head with one of those corporate splice chips, and I'll rewire your vocal processor to sound like a garbage compactor. I muttered, wincing as a cooling gel was applied to my face. Jax, let them help you, Lyra said. She was standing by the observation port, her gaze fixed on the violet swirl of the Velos Nebula as we pulled away from the station. She had changed back into her regal attire, a gown of woven carbon fibers that shimmered between deep blue and matte black. The obsidian pins in her hair looked like tiny frozen stars. I don't need help from things that don't have grease under their fingernails, I said, sliding off the bunk. I felt a bit dizzy. The stunt in the administrator's office had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit. Bypassing a station-grade firewall using your own nervous system as a conductor is the kind of thing they tell you never to do in the first year of engineering school. Mostly because you usually end up as a vegetable or a very expensive charcoal briquette. You saved 10,000 people today, Lyra said, turning toward me. Her amber eyes were searching my face, looking for something I wasn't sure I wanted her to find. The administrator, Harlan, is currently being interviewed by my Marines. He's already admitted that the energy siphoners were provided by an off-book subsidiary of the hegemony. Chancellor Malakor's signature is all over the digital ledger. Great. You caught the slicer red-handed. Now drop me back at the shatter docks. I have a workbench to rebuild and a pulsar filter that isn't going to solder itself. Lyra walked over to me, her footsteps silent on the deck. She placed a hand on my arm. Her skin was warm, and for a second, the headache in my optic nerve actually subsided. Ouroboros 9 is no longer safe for you, Jax. Malachor failed to harvest the station, but he succeeded in identifying the one variable he couldn't account for. You. To the bureaucrats on Vesper Prime, a man with your technical skills and a complete lack of a price tag is a system-wide anomaly. They won't just try to buy you again, they'll try to delete you. I've been deleted before, I grunted, pulling my arm away. The mining colony I grew up on? We were just numbers on a production sheet until the veins ran dry. Then we were just scrap. I'm used to being an anomaly. This is different. I'm asking you to come to Vesper Prime as my primary technical advisor. Not as a subject, Jax, as a consultant. I need someone who can look at the infrastructure of my empire and tell me where the rot is before the whole thing collapses under the weight of its own corruption. I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see the queen. I saw the girl who had knelt in the grime of a docking bay, genuinely curious about how a drive coupling worked. She was scared, not of pirates or core collapses, but of the machine she had inherited. Consulting rates apply, I said, my voice rough, and I'm not wearing a tuxedo. 40 soul credits an hour, she asked, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. 80. Travel time is a killer. She nodded. Agreed. But there is something you need to see before we arrive. The droid found it during your diagnostic scan. She gestured to a holographic display that flickered to life in the center of the room. It showed my own biological profile, a messy map of scars, old fractures, and the neural pathways of my haptic sight. But there was something else, a small, pulsing red icon near the base of my spine. What's that? I asked, squinting. A dormant infection? It's a soul credit tether, Lyra said, her voice dropping into a tone of cold fury. It's a micro-transponder built into the standard-issue life support boosters given to every miner on the outer colonies. It doesn't just track your health, Jax. It monitors your biological time. Every soul credit you ever spent on Ouroboros 9 was being deducted from your actual life expectancy. The system was designed to ensure that the poor literally trade their seconds for the right to exist. I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the ship's climate control. I thought about my father, coughing his lungs out in the red dust of the mining pits, insisting that we keep working so we could earn enough time for the next month's rations. I thought he was just tired. I didn't know the credits were a literal death clock. That slicer, I whispered, my hands clenching into fists. Malachor, he isn't just a thief, he's a parasite. He is the architect of the current economic framework, Lyra said, and according to that readout, you have approximately 15 years of biological reserve left because of the high-stress environments you've worked in. If the Ouroboros 9 harvest had succeeded, that number would have dropped to 0 tonight for every inhabitant on the station. I looked at the red icon, the literal proof of my own mortality, and then at Lyra. The humanistic theme I had lived by, that integrity was the only thing that didn't rust, was being tested by the ultimate price tag. My own life. "Can you remove it?" I asked. "My doctors can," she said, "but the system is linked to the hegemony's central ledger. If we cut the tether without overriding the protocol at the source, it will trigger a default signal. You'd be dead within minutes as the nanites in the booster fluid stop your heart." I sat back down on the bunk, the weight of the realization pressing in on me. I had spent my life thinking I was autonomous, that by refusing the big credits and staying in the shadows, I had kept my soul mine. But the system had been siphoning me since I was a kid. I was just a part in a machine I never agreed to join. "So we go to Vesper Prime," I said, looking up at her. "Not for the titles, not for the land. We go there because that machine is broken at the core sink, and I'm going to be the one to rip it out." "Now you're thinking like an engineer," Lyra said. The journey to the heart of the Vesperal hegemony took 3 days of transit through the jump gates. During that time, I didn't sit in the luxury lounges or eat the 5-course meals the stewards tried to force on me. I spent my time in the resplendent dawn secondary engineering bay, stripping down my toolkit and cleaning every wrench until the metal shone like glass. It was the only way I could keep the static in my head from becoming a roar. I also spent hours talking to Lyra. She would find me in the middle of a diagnostic run, sitting on a deck plate with a data slate, and we'd argue. Not about mechanics this time, but about the hegemony. "You call it a system of collective security," I said on the second night, tossing a worn bolt into a scrap bin. "But from where I'm sitting, it looks like a pyramid scheme, where the people at the bottom provide the bricks and the people at the top just admire the view." "The Soul Credit system was originally designed to prevent overconsumption of resources," Lyra argued, leaning against a power conduit. She looked less like a queen and more like a student under fire. "It was supposed to be a way to ensure that everyone contributed to the survival of the hegemony. If resources are finite, time must be the regulator." "That's a load of space dust, Lyra. Resources are only finite because your slicers in the High Council hoard 80% of the energy output for their paradise worlds. You don't regulate consumption by killing the consumers. You regulate it by fixing the damn distribution grids." "And how would you do that, Jax? Without the credits, how do you motivate a miner on a rock 2,000 light years from the nearest sun? You give them a reason to care that isn't a gun to their head or a clock on their heart. You give them equity. You make them owners of the system, not just components." She was quiet for a long time after that, watching me work. I could feel her conflict through our growing core sink, a strange, empathetic link that had formed ever since the firewall bypass. She wanted to believe her empire was good, but she was seeing the fractures I was pointing out, and she knew that if she didn't fix them, the next person to come along with a wrench wouldn't be looking to repair the machine. They'd be looking to tear it down. As we approached Vesper Prime, the scale of the broken system became impossible to ignore. The planet didn't just have cities, it was a city, a world-spanning metropolis of white stone and gold glass, surrounded by an orbital ring that processed more data in a second than Ouroboros 9 did in a century. "Welcome to the capital," Lyra said as we entered the final docking approach. I looked at the shimmering towers and the hundreds of ships flitting about like hummingbirds. It was beautiful, sure. But all I could see were the millions of soul credit tethers pulsing in the dark. "Nice paint job," I muttered, grabbing my tool chest. "Let's see if the manifolds are as pretty as the facade." The turning point wasn't the arrival, or even the meeting with the High Council that was scheduled for that evening. It was the moment I stepped off the shuttle and saw a group of maintenance workers on the dock. They were Vesperal citizens, dressed in clean uniforms, but their eyes had that same glazed, exhausted look I'd seen in my father's face. One of them fumbled a heavy battery pack, and as it hit the ground, he didn't curse. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at it with a paralyzing terror, his hand instinctively going to the base of his spine. He was checking his time. He was calculating how many minutes of his life he had just lost by dropping that battery. I walked over to him, ignoring the Vesperal guards who bristled at my movement. I picked up the battery pack and handed it to the man. "It's just a casing crack, pal," I said, my voice low and steady. "Don't let the slicers tell you it's a total loss. I can fix this in 5 minutes." The man looked at me, then at my oil-stained hands, and for a split second, I saw a spark of actual humanity return to his eyes. But then he saw Lyra standing behind me, and he bowed so low his forehead hit the deck. "Jax, we have to go," Lyra whispered, her face pale. I stood up, the battery grease staining my palm. I looked at her, and then at the shimmering spires of the Capitol. "The lesson here isn't about how to rule, Lyra," I said, loud enough for the guards to hear. "The lesson is that when you start valuing the system more than the people in it, you've already lost the war. You're just waiting for the core to melt." We walked toward the High Palace, the mechanic and the Queen, but for the first time, I felt like the one in charge. Because I was the only one in this entire world who knew that some things are worth more than time, and I was about to show the High Council exactly what happens when you try to put a price on the truth. Vesper Prime's High Palace was a monument to the very concept of excess. It was called the Atmospheric Cathedral, a structure that didn't just sit on the planet's surface, but pierced the upper ionosphere, its spire harvesting raw energy directly from the solar winds. Inside, the walls were lined with living tapestries, colonies of bioluminescent algae that shifted patterns based on the emotional state of the room. Currently, they were a jagged, angry crimson. The High Council was already assembled in the Hall of Equilibrium. 12 men and women sat in elevated pods that drifted around a central dais, their faces obscured by glint visors that projected their current soul credit balance in shimmering gold digits. It was the ultimate display of status. In this room, if your number wasn't in the billions, you were effectively invisible. I stood on the central dais next to Lyra, my tool chest at my feet. I felt like a grain of sand in a high-end watch, small, gritty, and entirely capable of stopping the gears. "Majesty," a voice boomed from the lead pod. It was Chancellor Malachor. He had discarded the mahogany and velvet look for a suit of shimmering white scales. His glint visor displayed a number that made my head spin. "You return with a anomaly." The reports from Ouroboros 9 were troubling. A station-wide malfunction nearly resulted in a catastrophic loss of Imperial assets. "Malfunctioning, Chancellor?" Lyra's voice was as cold as the void between stars. "The only malfunction was the energy siphoners your people installed in the station's guts. They were siphoning soul credits directly into an offshore account linked to your ministry." A murmur rippled through the pods. The crimson tapestries on the walls pulsed like a heartbeat. "Speculation," Malachor dismissed with a wave of his hand. "The equipment was part of a routine efficiency audit. If the local mechanic had stayed in his shop instead of interfering with Imperial protocols, the station would have been stabilized without incident." He turned his visor toward me. "Jax Thorne, a scrap Hulk technician with a history of insubordination and a biological reserve of less than 15 years. You are a man who understands the value of a single second, yet you throw your time away on principles that have no market value. Why?" I stepped forward, the magnets in my boots clicking against the polished dais. "Because unlike you, Chancellor, I know the difference between a system that works and a system that's just shiny. You've built this whole empire on a lie. You tell people they're trading time for security, but you're just bleeding them dry to keep these pods floating. You're not a leader. You're a failing manifold trying to hide the leak with gold leaf." "Insolence!" a woman in the third pod cried out. Her visor flared. "You are here as a guest only by the Queen's whim. You have no standing to criticize the equilibrium." "I'm the guy who's going to fix the leak," I said, reaching into my tool chest and pulling out the 3 violet siphoners I'd ripped off the pylon on Ouroboros 9. I tossed them onto the dais floor. They skittered and hummed, their dead lights casting long, eerie shadows. "These aren't just batteries, they're encoders, and I've already run a reverse trace on the firmware. They aren't just siphoning energy, they're siphoning the default triggers." Lyra frowned, looking at me. "Jax, you didn't tell me about the triggers." "I only found them an hour ago when I was cleaning my gear," I said, my voice dropping into a technical growl. "These leeches weren't just taking credits. They were programmed to send a death signal to the tethers of anyone who complained about the system. It's a silent execution protocol, Lyra. Malachor isn't just a thief, he's a butcher. The room went deathly silent. The tapestries turned a bruised purple. Even the drifting pods seemed to stall in midair. Malachor's visor flickered, the gold numbers jumping erratically. You cannot prove that. The code is proprietary. It's classified for the safety of the hegemony. Safety? I've seen better safety on a black market fusion cutter, I spat. I'm a mechanic, Chancellor. I don't care about your proprietary laws. I care about how the solder flows. And I've already sent the decryption key to every comm relay on Vesper Prime. In about 5 minutes, every citizen with a tether is going to see exactly what you've been doing with their seconds. You fool! Malachor roared, his pod diving toward the dais. You've triggered a systemic destabilization. If the people default en masse, the entire grid will collapse. Vesper Prime will go dark. Then we'd better start rewiring, I said, looking at Lyra. But Lyra didn't look at me with pride. She looked at me with horror. Jax, what have you done? She whispered. Vesper Prime isn't Ouroboros 9. The life support for this entire planet, the atmospheric cathedral, is powered by the Soul Credit Exchange. If the ledger is compromised, the oxygen scrubbers for 3 billion people will shut down to protect the core integrity. You haven't liberated them. You've suffocated them. The cost of my integrity hit me like a physical blow. I had focused so hard on the truth, on exposing the corruption, that I had forgotten the basic rule of engineering. You never bypass the safety valve until you've secured the pressure tank. My prejudice against the slicers and the elites had blinded me to the reality that they were all part of the same interconnected life support system. The lights in the Hall of Equilibrium flickered, a sickening, deep red pulse. A low-frequency groan vibrated through the floor plates. System default initiated, the Palace AI stated in a flat, emotionless tone. Soul Credit Exchange offline. Atmospheric scrubbers entering dormant mode. Estimated breathable air remaining, 4 hours. I can fix this, I said, but for the first time my voice lacked its usual technical certainty. My hands were shaking. I can bridge the reactor to a manual override. The cathedral's core is 3 kilometers down, shielded by 1,000 layers of biometal. Malachor sneered, though he looked terrified. No one can reach it in time. We are all dead because a mechanic wanted to make a philosophical point. Jax, Lyra said, her hand gripping my shoulder so hard her nails dug into my coveralls. This is the solder point. You told me that some things are worth more than time. Now prove it. Fix the world you just broke, or the truth won't matter, because there will be no one left to hear it. I looked at her, and then at the shimmering, dying city outside the window. This was the turning point. I had spent my life as a loner, an autonomous ghost who fixed ships and ignored the bigger picture. I had valued my own integrity above the messy, compromised reality of the galaxy, and now that same integrity had become a weapon of mass destruction. Silas was right, I muttered, grabbing my pulse veiner. I'm a total slicer. I turned to the High Council, my haptic sight flaring into a blinding white light as I forced the dead implant to interface with the palace's local net. The pain was excruciating, like someone was driving a white-hot needle into my brain. Listen up, you gold-plated vultures, I roared through the agony. If you want to breathe past midnight, you're going to do exactly what I say. No protocols, no credits, just sweat and grease. I looked at Lyra. I need your access codes for the primary atmospheric pylons, and I need a squad of Marines who aren't afraid to get their white armor dirty. We're not going to the core, we're going to the scrubbers. We're going to bypass the exchange ledger and wire the oxygen directly to the solar wind intake. That's impossible, Malachor stammered. The harmonics will be unstable. The cathedral will shake itself apart. Then we'll hold it together with our bare hands, I shot back. Lyra, move, now! We burst out of the Hall of Equilibrium, leaving the stunned counselors in their drifting pods. As we ran through the corridors of the atmospheric cathedral, the air already starting to feel thin and metallic, I realized that I had finally learned the lesson Lyra had been trying to teach me. Integrity isn't just about refusing money or telling the truth. It's about taking responsibility for the systems you inhabit, even the ones you hate. It's about realizing that a mechanic's job isn't just to fix the machine, it's to keep the people inside alive. We reached the primary scrubber hub on level 200. It was a cavernous space filled with massive, spinning turbines and miles of throbbing organic conduits. It looked like the lungs of a god, and it was slowing down. Jax, the feedback loop is starting, Lyra shouted over the groaning machinery. The ledger is trying to lock the valves. I lunged for the main control panel, my pulse viner singing as I carved through the obsidian casing. Sparks showered over me, burning through my coveralls, but I didn't feel them. All I could feel was the vibration of the station, the heartbeat of 3 billion people. I'm going to bridge the command circuits, I yelled, jamming a pair of heavy-duty pliers into the gearworks. Lyra, hold that pressure lever. If it snaps back, the whole hub will blow. She didn't hesitate. The queen of the Vesperal hegemony, the woman who ruled 6 star systems, lunged into the grease and the steam. She grabbed the rusted iron lever with both hands, her starlight gown tearing, her expensive jewelry scattering across the deck. I've got it, she screamed, her face flushed with effort. I worked with a feverish intensity I'd never known. I wasn't just fabricating a bracket or soldering a wire. I was weaving a new system on the fly, using the shattered remains of the old one. I bypassed the credit exchange, routed the power through the emergency reserves, and used my own haptic sight to synchronize the harmonics of the solar wind. Rapid unplanned assembly, I roared, slamming my fist against the final contact point. The turbines roared to life with a sound that shook the very foundations of the cathedral. A blast of fresh, untainted air surged through the conduits, nearly knocking me off my feet. The red emergency lights turned a steady, calm green. I slumped against a cooling rib, my lungs burning, my vision swimming. I looked at Lyra. She was covered in oil, her blonde hair matted with sweat, her hands raw from the lever. She looked beautiful. She looked real. We did it, she gasped, sliding down the wall to sit beside me. Standard rate, I wheezed, closing my eyes. 80 soul credits an hour, plus maybe an extra 100 for saving the planet. Jax, she said, her voice soft and trembling. You didn't just save the planet. You broke the machine. Without the exchange ledger, the tethers have no power. Malachor is done. The equilibrium is finished. I opened one eye and looked at her. The system is still broken, Lyra. We just patched the lungs. The heart, the soul, that's going to take a lot more work. I know, she said, reaching out to take my hand. But I think I know a good mechanic. I looked at our joined hands, one scarred and greasy, one pale and trembling, and realized that the connection between us was the only thing that didn't devalue in this entire galaxy. We had crossed the impossible distance between our worlds, not with wealth, but with the simple, gritty truth of a job done well. But as the air of Vesper Prime filled my lungs, I knew the real test was just beginning. Because fixing a ship is easy. Fixing a civilization? That's the kind of repair that never truly ends. The tapestries on the walls began to shift again, turning a soft, hopeful gold. It was a start, one weld at a time. The golden light of Vesper Prime was fading into a bruised electric violet as the atmospheric cathedral's primary power grid groaned under the weight of its new improvised reality. I stood on a balcony overlooking the city sector, known as the Gilded Spire, my dead haptic sight implant itching like a buried splinter. Below us, the world was screaming. It wasn't the scream of a core collapse, which is a singular, high-pitched wail of stressed metal. This was the collective roar of 3 billion people realizing that the clocks on their hearts had stopped ticking and the bank accounts in their heads were empty. Freedom, I realized, was a hell of a mess to clean up. The riots have reached the second-tier districts, Lyra said, joining me at the railing. She had traded her torn starlight gown for a set of matte black tactical fatigues provided by the few palace guards, who hadn't defected to the highest bidder the moment the soul credit ledger went dark. She looked leaner, harder, and significantly less like a sovereign. The people who were wealthy yesterday are terrified that they've lost their immortality. The people who were poor are terrified that there's no one left to give them orders. That's the problem with your system, Lyra, I said, rubbing the scar behind my ear. You didn't just build an economy. You built a biological dependency. You taught them that their value was a number on a screen. Now the screen is black, and they don't know who they are without the digits. And you, Jax? She asked, her amber eyes reflecting the flickering neon fires in the streets below. My medical team tells me your tether is still active, but it's disconnected from the central server. You have approximately 15 years of biological life force remaining. You could take a shuttle, leave this sector, and live those years in peace. Why are you still standing here in the smoke? Because the job isn't finished, I grunted. I'm a mechanic. I don't walk away from a machine just because it started spitting sparks. We patched the oxygen scrubbers, but the core synchronization is still drifting. If we don't secure the ghost core, Malachor is going to reboot the old ledger from a backup. And this time, he'll include a purge code for anyone who didn't stay loyal. The ghost core, Lyra whispered. A myth from my grandfather's era. A secondary deep crust processing center designed to maintain the hegemony if the surface was vaporized. I thought it was decommissioned 80 years ago. Nothing in an empire is ever truly decommissioned, Lyra. It just gets reclassified as a black site. Malachor's signature wasn't just on the siphons, it was on the maintenance logs for the deep crust conduits. He's been prepping that site for a decade. He knew that eventually someone like me would come along and try to break the surface ledger. He didn't build a safety valve, he built a bunker for the thieves. A sudden low-frequency rumble vibrated through the balcony, making the stonework chatter. My haptic sight, even in its broken state, picked up the signature. It was a massive energy draw, originating from the planet's mantle. He's initiating the reboot, I said, grabbing my tool chest. If that ghost core comes online, it's going to ping every tether on the planet. It'll force a resynchronization. Anyone whose time balance was low before the collapse will be marked as a defaulted asset. They'll drop dead in the streets to provide the startup energy for the new system. How many? Lyra asked, her voice trembling. Half the planet, maybe more. He's not just trying to take back control, Lyra. He's trying to consolidate the wealth of 3 billion souls into a few thousand loyal accounts. It's the ultimate harvest. Lyra straightened her shoulders, her bioluminescent ink flaring a determined steady gold. Then we stop him, not as a queen and her mechanic, but as the only two people who know where the solder points are. We move through the palace's secondary service tunnels, avoiding the main corridors where the living tapestries were now a chaotic, thrashing mess of gray and black, the emotional signature of a world in total panic. We reach the heavy lift elevators that service the planet's crust mines. The lift was a massive, rusted cage that smelled of ancient minerals and ozone. As we descended, the temperature began to rise, the air becoming thick with the scent of molten silicate. Jax, Lyra said as the lift rattled deeper into the dark. About what you said earlier, about my system. I spent 75 years in stasis or on the throne, believing that the soul credits were the only thing keeping the peace. I thought that without a quantifiable value for time, people would just drift into the void. I thought I was protecting them from their own laziness. Laziness is just a corporate word for people who want to choose their own complications, Lyra. You didn't protect them. You caged them. You made them believe that a minute spent staring at the stars was a minute stolen from the hegemony. You turned the most beautiful thing about being alive, the fact that it ends, into a debt trap. She looked at her hands, which were still stained with the grease from the oxygen hub. If we stop Malachor, if we kill the soul credit system forever, what happens to them? How do they survive without the booster nanites? How do they live with the knowledge that their time is finally their own? They live the way I do, I said, one day at a time. They'll make mistakes. They'll make bad welds. Some of them will probably wish they had the cage back because freedom is terrifyingly heavy. But they'll be real, and for a mechanic, real is the only thing that matters. The lift slammed into the bottom of the shaft with a bone-jarring thud. The doors hissed open to reveal the deep crust vault, a cavernous space where the walls were made of raw, pulsing obsidian, and the floor was a network of glowing, violet data cables. At the center of the vault sat the ghost core, a pulsating sphere of biometal that looked like a giant, artificial heart. And standing before it, surrounded by a dozen sovereigns' shadow units, was Chancellor Malachor. He didn't look like a bureaucrat anymore. He had integrated himself into a command exoskeleton, a skeletal frame of white composite that hissed with steam and crackled with energy. His glint visor was gone, replaced by a neural link that fed directly into his spine. "You're persistent, Mr. Thorne," Malakor's voice boomed, amplified by the vault's acoustics. "I'll give you that. You have the tenacity of a termite in a mahogany palace, but you're out of your depth. You're trying to fix a leak in a dam that's already burst." "The only thing that's burst is your ego, Malakor," I said, stepping out of the lift with my pulse viner in hand. "I've seen your reboot code. It's sloppy. You're trying to force a 3 billion soul sync on a secondary processor. You're going to blow the whole crust before you get your first credit." "A calculated risk," Malakor sneered. "The hegemony requires a hard reset. The weak must be pruned so the strong can flourish." Her Majesty here has grown soft, blinded by the dirty hands of a scrap Hulk drifter. She's forgotten that a queen is just an administrator of assets, and right now the assets need to be revalued. Lyra stepped forward, her kinetic pistol leveled at Malakor's chest. "A queen is a protector of people, Chancellor. You're just a slicer who got lucky with a ledger. Step away from the core, or I'll see if your exoskeleton is as bulletproof as your bank account." Malakor laughed, a cold, mechanical sound. "The shadow units are loyal to the system, Majesty, not to you, and the system demands the reboot." The specialists moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, their active camo panels flickering as they fanned out to surround us. I felt the vibration in the floor. The ghost core was at 90% capacity. The resync signal was seconds away from firing. "Jax, the core!" Lyra shouted. I didn't go for Malakor. I knew I couldn't beat 12 trained killers in a firefight. I did what I always did. I looked for the system's weakest point. The ghost core wasn't cooled by ether or liquid nitrogen. It was deep crust, which meant it used the planet's own thermal gradients to vent its heat. There was a primary heat sink pylon right behind Malakor, a pillar of crystallized carbon that acted as a bridge to the cooler upper mantle. If I could fracture that pylon, the core wouldn't reboot. It would melt. I didn't use a wrench. I didn't use a pistol. I pulled a small, high-density sonic resonator from my chest, a tool used for clearing blockages in mining drills. I set it to the frequency of crystallized carbon and hurled it toward the pylon. "Total slicer move," I roared. The resonator slapped against the pylon and began to hum, a high, piercing note that made the obsidian walls vibrate. Malakor saw it too late. "No, you'll destabilize the entire vault." "Better the vault than the people," I shot back. The pylon shattered. A wave of intense, subterranean heat flooded the vault as the cooling bridge failed. The ghost core turned a violent, screaming orange, the biometal skin beginning to slough off like melting wax. The shadow units faltered, their camo panels shorting out in the extreme temperature. "Kill them!" Malakor shrieked, his exoskeleton hissing as he lunged toward me. The vault exploded into a chaos of static, smoke, and kinetic bolts. Lyra was a blur of motion, her pistol barking as she covered my retreat toward the core terminal. I was running blind, my haptic sight a white-hot roar of agony in my skull. But I could feel the system. I could feel the broken, bleeding heart of the hegemony, and I knew exactly where to put the final weld. I reached the terminal just as Malakor's white-clad hand slammed into my shoulder, his exoskeleton servos whining as they tried to crush my collarbone. "You! Nothing!" Malakor hissed, his visorless eyes red with fury. "You've destroyed 70 years of progress. You've killed the dream." "The dream was a nightmare, pal," I gritted out, the pain in my shoulder making the world turn gray. "And I'm the wake-up call." I jammed my pulse viner directly into the ghost core's primary data node. Rapid, unplanned disassembly. The world turned to white starlight. The silence that followed the destruction of the ghost core was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a quiet room. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a tomb 2 kilometers below the earth. I was lying on my back, the obsidian floor vibrating with the cooling death throes of the artificial heart. My tool chest was scattered across the vault, my wrenches looking like discarded teeth. I tried to sit up, but my left arm refused to cooperate. Malakor's exoskeleton had done a number on my shoulder, and the feedback from the pulse viner had left my nerves feeling like they'd been dipped in acid. "Jax?" A hand touched my face. Lyra. She was covered in soot, her black fatigues singed and bloody, but her amber eyes were clear. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and something that looked like heartbreak. "Did we get him?" I wheezed. She gestured to the center of the vault. Malakor's white exoskeleton was slumped against the melted remains of the ghost core, fused to the biometal in a grotesque, permanent embrace. He was still alive, his chest heaving in shallow, ragged gasps, but the golden numbers on his display were gone. He was creditless. He was just a man, dying in a suit that no longer recognized his authority. "The shadow units have retreated," Lyra said. "When the core melted, the signal loop died. Without the reboot command, they had no mission. They just vanished into the tunnels." "The people?" I asked, grabbing her hand to steady myself. "The resync, did it fire?" "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You broke the needle before it could hit the vein, Jax. The tethers are dead. Every single one. 3 billion people just became masters of their own seconds." I leaned my head back against the obsidian, a ragged laugh bubbling up in my chest. "Standard rate, Lyra. 80 credits. I'm going to be the richest man on a planet with no currency." "Jax, look at me." She pulled me up, her hands gripping my shoulders. Her bioluminescent ink was fading, the golden glow replaced by a soft, natural silver. "The nanites," I said, the realization hitting me. The soul credit system was the only thing keeping the life support boosters active. If the system is dead, the nanites in our blood, they're going to start idling. "We're going to age, Jax," she said, tears tracing paths through the soot on her cheeks. "Truly age. For the first time in 70 years, I can feel the weight of my own time. I can feel the years I tried to steal from the void coming back to claim me." "Welcome to the human race, Majesty," I said, reaching up to wipe a tear away with my grease-stained thumb. "It's a short walk, but the view is better when you know it's the only one you've got." Transformation, I realized, was a painful weld. We had broken the cycle of efficient slavery, but we had also destroyed the safety net that had kept Vesper Prime stable for a century. The 3 days that followed were a blur of technical triage and political survival. We emerged from the deep crust vault into a world that was unrecognizable. The atmospheric cathedral was no longer a palace, it was a refugee camp. The living tapestries had died, replaced by thousands of paper maps and improvised lists of survivors. The air smelled of wood smoke and real sweat, not the filtered nothingness of the hegemony's peak. I spent those days in the guts of the city, my arm in a sling, directing teams of former miners and station technicians. We weren't siphoning time anymore. We were rebuilding the power grids using old-school mechanical principles. We were wiring the solar collectors to community batteries, ensuring that the hospitals and the water recyclers stayed online because people chose to keep them running, not because they were being paid in biological years. Lyra was in the streets, her tactical fatigues replaced by a simple gray tunic. She wasn't giving orders from a floating pod. She was sitting in the grime with the defaults, listening to their stories, helping them understand that their lives weren't assets to be managed. She was becoming a leader by losing her crown. On the 4th night, I found her sitting on the ruins of the main pylon in the gilded spire. The city below was dark, save for the flickering campfires of 10,000 communities. "You look like a mechanic," I said, handing her a cup of coffee that actually tasted like coffee. Bitter, hot, and honest. "I feel like one," she said, accepting the cup. She looked older. The fine lines around her eyes were more pronounced, and her blonde hair had streaks of silver that hadn't been there a week ago. "I spent today fixing a hydro pump in District 9. A man named Thomas taught me how to use a compression sleeve. He didn't know I was his queen. He just thought I was a girl with a steady hand." "Thomas is a good slicer," I said. "He knows his manifolds." She looked at me, her expression serious. "The Vesperal fleet is in orbit, Jax. Chancellor Malakor's loyalists are gone, but the other star systems are demanding answers. They want me to come back. They want me to reinstall the ledger and bring order back to the quadrant." I felt a cold prickle of apprehension. And I told them to drift," she said, a fierce, beautiful smile lighting up her face. "I told them that Vesper Prime is no longer an asset. It's a home, and homes don't have ledgers." I sat beside her, the magnets in my boots clicking softly against the ruined stone. The humanistic theme I had lived by, that integrity was the only currency that didn't devalue, had finally moved from my workbench to the heart of a civilization. We had chosen broken freedom over perfect control, and while the road ahead was going to be full of fractures and structural shear, it was our road. "I'm going back to Ouroboros 9, Lyra," I said quietly. "The shatter docks are a mess, and Silas probably hasn't cleaned a filter since I left. Someone's got to remind that station that it's still part of the universe." She looked at me, and for a moment the Queen returned, not in the power she wielded, but in the responsibility she carried. "I can't go with you, Jax. These people, they're just starting to breathe. I have to stay here and make sure they don't forget how." "I know," I said. "The weld is set. Now we just have to let it cool." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was a handcrafted drive coupling made from the melted down metal of my first workbench. It wasn't worth a single soul credit, but it was perfectly balanced. "Standard rate for a consult," I said, pressing it into her hand. "Free talk. Fair work." Lyra closed her fingers around the metal, her amber eyes shining in the firelight. "You're a terrible businessman, Jax Thorne." "Maybe," I said, standing up and grabbing my tool chest. "But I'm a hell of a mechanic." As I walked toward the shuttle that would take me back to my scrap Hulk station, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the vibration of the world behind me, a steady, rhythmic hum of a billion lives being lived on their own terms. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't optimized. It was messy, beautiful, and completely real. And as any good engineer knows, that's the only way a system ever truly survives, one weld at a time, one day at a time. The truth doesn't rust, and neither does a heart that's finally free to stop ticking for someone else. I boarded the shuttle, the door hissing shut with the satisfying click of a component properly seated. I had 15 years left, and I was going to spend every second of them fixing things that were actually broken, starting with my own coffee maker. The jump gate flared, a brilliant white light that swallowed the shuttle and spat it out into the dark, violet expanse of the Velos Nebula. Ouroboros 9 was waiting, a rusty skull in the void, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was heading home. Not because of where I was going, but because of who I had become. A man with grease on his hands and a soul that belonged to no one but himself. Integrity is a hell of a thing. It doesn't pay for dreadnoughts, but it sure as hell makes for a good night's sleep. And as the stars wheeled overhead, I finally closed my eyes and let the mechanical symphony of the universe lull me into a rest that was finally, truly mine. The transition from jump space to the Velos Nebula always felt like being spat out of a pressurized hydraulic line into a bucket of cold oil. The purple gases swirled around the shuttle's hull, thick and unyielding, illuminated by the rhythmic, strobe-like pulses of the dying star at the center. Ouroboros 9 sat there in the middle of the mess, a moon-sized skull carved into 1,000 docking bays and residential tiers, looking more like a rusted relic than ever. But as I brought the shuttle into a wide, sweeping approach toward the shatter docks, I noticed something that made my haptic sight, now a dull, persistent ache in my skull, thrum with a strange new frequency. The station was glowing, not with the sickly orange of emergency lights or the harsh, blue glare of corporate-mandated efficiency, but with a warm, amber radiance that pulsed from the gaps in the Leviathan's bone structure. "Welcome back, Ghost Tech," I whispered to myself, my voice sounding thin in the quiet of the cockpit. My left arm was still strapped to my chest in a medical sling, and my body felt like it had been put through a trash compactor twice. But the sight of that rusty skull made my heart rate synchronize with the station's heartbeat for the first time in weeks. I bypassed the executive berths. I didn't want the pine-scented air or the matte white guards. I guided the shuttle toward Bay 99, the place where everything had started. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy metallic thud that vibrated through my teeth, a mechanical greeting that I preferred over any royal fanfare. When the ramp lowered, the air that hit me was the same as it had always been: copper, solvent, and the heavy, humid breath of a machine that was too old to care about its manners. But the silence I expected was gone. Instead, there was a cacophony of shouting, laughter, and the high-pitched whine of a dozen pulse-vining torches. "Thorne! Jax Thorne is back!" The shout came from a man standing on a pile of salvaged thruster housings. It was Silas. He didn't look like a dockmaster anymore. He was wearing a grease-stained welder's mask pushed up onto his forehead, and his hands were black with carbon residue. He scrambled down from the pile, nearly tripping over a loose floor plate, and caught me by the shoulders. "You're a dead man, Jax. You're a total slicer. I told everyone you'd probably ended up as a decorative fountain on Vesper Prime, but here you are, still smelling like a fuel leak," Silas roared, his eyes bright with a manic, exhausted energy. "I'm not dead yet, Silas. I've still got 15 years of biological reserve and a lot of work to do," I said, wincing as he accidentally jolted my bad shoulder. "What happened to the docks? It looks like a rapid, unplanned assembly in here." Silas gestured wildly around the bay. "The credits, Jax. The soul credits went dark 4 days ago. Everyone thought it was the end. People were staring at their visors, waiting for the default signal to stop their hearts. But it never came. The clocks just stopped. And then the message from the Queen hit the comms. She told us the ledger was gone. She told us we owned our own time now." I looked past him. Lisa from life support was there, elbow deep in a secondary atmospheric recycler, working alongside 2 men I recognized as former mid-tier slicers, guys who used to spend their days siphoning credits from the docking fees. They weren't siphoning anything now. They were holding a heavy-duty manifold steady while Lisa welded the coupling. "No one's giving orders?" I asked. "Orders? Jax, we're too busy trying to keep the station from drifting into the pulsar," Lisa called out, not looking up from her weld. "Without the central ledger, the automated maintenance bots all went into sleep mode. If we don't fix the scrubbers ourselves, we're breathing vacuum by next week. It's a hell of a mess, Thorne. It's glorious." I walked through the docks, my boots clicking against the familiar obsidian floor. The transformation was staggering. For 5 years, I'd watched these people move like ghosts, their eyes perpetually fixed on the gold digits of their visors, calculating the cost of every breath. Now the visors were gone. They were looking at the machines. They were looking at each other. The fear of time hadn't disappeared. It had been replaced by the urgency of reality. I reached my shop, or what was left of it. The door was still sealed with the emergency lock I'd toggled during the drone attack. I pressed my palm to the scanner, and the door hissed open, revealing a graveyard of my own making. The workbench was a blackened ruin. The pulsar filter I'd spent 40 hours on was a puddle of slag. The air was still heavy with the scent of the thermic lance that had nearly ended me. I sat on my claimed cargo container and looked at my hands. They were trembling. I'd spent my entire life running from the machine. I'd hidden on mining colonies, drifted through salvage yards, and eventually crawled into this basement on Ouroboros 9, thinking that if I just kept my head down and my welds clean, I could stay autonomous. I thought integrity was a wall I could build around myself to keep the world out. But Lyra had been right. Integrity isn't a wall. It's a bridge. By refusing the credits, I hadn't just kept my soul. I had inadvertently sparked a fire that had burned down an entire empire's cage. And now the heat from that fire was my responsibility to manage. "You look like a man who's realizing he forgot to tighten the primary intake bolts," a voice said from the doorway. It was Lisa. She was leaning against the frame, wiping her hands on a rag. She looked at the ruined shop and then at me. "I heard about Vesper Prime, Jax. Word travels fast when the Queen herself mentions a ghost tech from Ouroboros 9 in her liberation decree. They say you stared down the High Council and told them their bank accounts were garbage." "I just told them the manifolds were leaking, Lisa. They didn't like the technical assessment. They're saying you could have been a billionaire, a lord of star systems. You could have lived for 1,000 years in a stasis suite." I looked at the blackened remains of my workbench. "I'm a mechanic, Lisa. What would I do with 1,000 years? I'd just spend 900 of them bored and the other 100 wishing I was back in a shop that smelled like grease." Lisa laughed, a sharp, honest sound. "You're a total idiot, Thorne. But you're our idiot. The station board, or what's left of it, wants to appoint you as chief of infrastructure. They want you to design the new power grid, the one that doesn't run on souls." "I don't do policy," I said, the old defense mechanism kicking in automatically. "This isn't policy, Jax. It's engineering. We need to bridge the solar collectors to the residential tiers without a central processor to dictate the flow. We need a system that works because it's balanced, not because it's enforced. It's a repair job, Jax, the biggest one this station has ever seen. I looked at the charred pulsar filter. I thought about my father, dying in the red dust because his ledger was low. I thought about Lyra sitting on a ruined pylon on Vesper Prime, silver hair blowing in the smoke of a world she had to rebuild. Consulting rates apply, I said, a slow, gritty smile forming on my face. 80 soul credits an hour. Though I suppose we'll have to find a new way to measure soul credits, since the currency is dead. We're measuring in oxygen hours and thermal units now, Lisa said. Fair work for fair breath. It's a bit primitive, but the solder is holding. I stood up, ignoring the protest of my fractured shoulder. I reached into the wreckage of my tool cabinet and pulled out a battered, heavy-duty hyperspanner. It was old, the chrome plating peeling, but the adjustment mechanism was smooth. I felt the weight of it in my palm, a physical anchor to the person I chose to be. All right, Lisa, I said, show me the schematics for the residential scrubbers. If we're going to rebuild the lungs of this station, we'd better start before the CO2 scrubbers realize there's no one left to pay the bill. The next few weeks were a blur of rapid, unplanned assembly. Ouroboros 9 wasn't a palace, and the people weren't poets. But we worked with an intensity that the hegemony's engineers would never understand. We didn't have blueprints, so we extrapolated from the bones. We didn't have new parts, so we salvaged from the derelicts in the lower bays. We argued, we swore, we made mistakes, and we fixed them. I discovered that the slicers I'd spent years avoiding were actually decent mechanics once you took the glint visors off. I discovered that the dock workers had a collective genius for improvisation that defied any corporate logic. And I discovered that my integrity wasn't a burden I had to carry alone. It was a standard that everyone else was starting to aim for. I was finishing a bypass on the Deck 12 water recycler, a nasty, dripping job that had me soaked to the bone in gray water, when my comm bead chirped. It was a private signal, one I hadn't heard since I left the resplendent dawn. Jax, are you there? The voice was older. The melodic chime of the Queen was gone, replaced by the weary, steady tone of a woman who had been working in the trenches. Lyra, I said, sitting back on my heels and wiping water from my eyes. How's the rebuilding going? Did the star systems realize their homes yet? They're trying, she said, her voice carrying across the light years with a warmth that felt like a localized solar flare. There was a counter-revolution attempt on Ethelgard. The corporate remnants tried to reactivate a local ledger. The people didn't fire a single shot. They just walked out of the refineries and let the systems redline until the managers begged them to come back for a percentage of the equity. A tactical walkout, I chuckled. That's a classic mechanics move. I learned it from a very blunt technical advisor, she said. Jax, I'm sending a courier shuttle to Ouroboros 9. It's carrying a shipment of high-grade biometal and a dozen new pulsar filters. No strings attached. Consider it a donation to the station's infrastructure fund. We'll take them, but tell the courier to dock at Bay 99. Bay 1 is currently being converted into a community greenhouse. A greenhouse? Lyra sounded delighted. In an executive berth? The air is better there, I said, and the pine scent was getting annoying. We were quiet for a moment, the hum of the recycler and the distant roar of the Vesperal city filling the gap between us. I could feel her time through the sink. She was aging, just like me. She was becoming real. I miss the talk, Jax, she said softly. Me too, Lyra, but the welds are holding, and that's the only victory that matters. One weld at a time, she whispered. I cut the comm and looked at the recycler. It was a mess of rusted pipes and leaking seals, but it was mine to fix. I picked up my hyperspanner and got back to work. The Velos Nebula was dark, the pulsar was dying, and I only had 15 years left. I wasn't going to waste a single second of them on a ledger. The clock on my workbench didn't count down to 0 anymore. It didn't track biological life expectancy or soul credit balances. It was an old mechanical timepiece I'd salvaged from a pre-hegemony freighter, its gears ticking with a rhythmic metallic precision that reminded me of my father's heartbeat. It was a simple tool for a simple job, telling me when it was time to eat, when it was time to sleep, and when it was time to teach the next generation of ghost techs how to read the scream of a stressed manifold. 2 years had passed since the ghost core melted into a lump of biometal at the center of Vesper Prime. 2 years of broken freedom. Ouroboros 9 was no longer a scrap hulk station where people went to die. It had become the Shatter Hub, the primary technical exchange for the Velos Nebula. We didn't have a high council. We had a maintenance board. We didn't have a currency. We had an equity grid where every hour of work contributed to the station's collective life support. It was messy, it was inefficient, and it was the most stable system I'd ever seen. I was standing at the center of the new power core on Deck 50, surrounded by 5 apprentices. They were a mix of station orphans, former slicers, and one runaway from the Vespral Inner Rim who had arrived with a shiny toy ship and a lot of arrogance. I'd spent the last 3 hours showing them how to synchronize the solar collectors to the gravity well without using an automated buffer. The metal doesn't lie to you, I said, gesturing to the glowing violet conduits. A computer will tell you the pressure is within tolerance because the code says it should be. But a computer doesn't feel the vibration in the floor plates. It doesn't smell the ozone before the spark. You have to listen to the machine, not the display. But the blueprints say the margin is 0.5%, Master Thorne. The Vesperal runaway, a boy named Kale, said, squinting at his tablet. The blueprints were written by slicers in a climate-controlled office on Vesper Prime. I grunted, taking the tablet from his hand and tossing it onto a nearby crate. On this station, the margin is whatever the weld says it is. Now pick up that pulse viner and show me you can knit those 2 circuits without blowing the residential fuses. If you screw it up, you're on waste reclamation duty for a week. Standard rate. Kyle hesitated, then stepped toward the core. His hands were shaking, but his grip on the torch was firm. He'd been with me for 6 months, and the golden sheen of his elite upbringing had been scrubbed away by grease and honest sweat. He was becoming a mechanic. I watched him work, my haptic sight implant, now replaced by a custom-built, non-corporate model, painting the flow of energy in steady, calm ambers. He made the weld. It wasn't perfect. It was a bit chunky at the edges, but the synchronization held. The floor plates remained still. Good enough, I said, clapping him on the shoulder. Clean the slag off the contact points and then go get some coffee. The real stuff, not that synthesized runoff Sam used to sell. As the apprentices filed out, laughing and arguing about structural harmonics, a figure stepped from the shadows of the secondary pylon. She wasn't wearing a cloak this time. She wore a simple, functional engineer's jumpsuit in deep navy, her blonde hair cut short in a practical bob that highlighted the silver streaks at her temples. She looked 60 years old, though I knew she was technically over 70. She looked tired, her skin etched with the fine lines of a life lived in the sun rather than a stasis pod. She looked like the most beautiful thing in the galaxy. Lyra, I said, my voice catching in my throat. Jax, she replied, walking toward me. She didn't move like a queen anymore. She moved like someone who knew exactly where her feet were landing. I heard you were teaching. The grand engineer of the Shatter Hub finally decided to share his secrets? I'm just telling them the truth, Lyra. Someone's got to remind them that the machines don't care about their feelings. She stopped in front of me, her amber eyes searching mine. The core sink between us flared, a warm, steady resonance that had never faded. The Vespral hegemony is gone, Jax. We ratified the final dissolution treaty yesterday. The star systems are now a voluntary confederation of autonomous worlds. No ledgers, no tethers, just people choosing to work together. And the Chancellor? Malachor is still fused to the core. We turned the vault into a museum, a reminder of what happens when you try to own the time of others. He's a very popular exhibit for school children. I laughed, a deep, easy sound. Poetic justice. I like it. Biwi. We walked out onto the observation balcony, looking out at the Velos Nebula. The pulsar was spinning in the distance, a blinding lighthouse in the purple dark. Around the station, dozens of ships were docked. Freighters, salvage hulks, and even a few Vespral dreadnoughts that had been converted into mobile hospitals and research stations. You've got 13 years left, Jax, Lyra said softly, her hand finding mine. Her grip was calloused and strong. 13 years of biological reserve. What are you going to do with them? I looked at my hands, the scars and the grease stains that told the story of every repair, every failure, and every victory I'd ever had. I thought about the billions of people who were now master of their own seconds. I thought about the integrity that had been the only constant in my life, the only thing that hadn't rusted, even when the galaxy was falling apart. I'm going to spend them right here, I said, fixing things, one weld at a time. Because in a universe where everything else is for sale, a job done well for a fair price is the only thing that actually lasts. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver object, the handcrafted drive coupling I'd given her 2 years ago. She had returned it to me when she arrived. I held it up to the light of the pulsar. It's still balanced, I noted. Just like us, she said, leaning her head against my shoulder. We stood there for a long time, the mechanic and the former queen, watching the stars wheel overhead. The mechanical symphony of Ouroboros 9 hummed around us, the wheeze of the scrubbers, the clang of the pipes, the rhythmic throb of the core. It was a broken, beautiful system, held together by the integrity of the people inside it. And for a mechanic who only ever wanted autonomy, it was the perfect repair. I spent 30 years of my life thinking that the best way to stay whole was to stay alone. I treated my integrity like a piece of high-grade titanium, something to be polished and hidden away in a velvet-lined chest so the world couldn't scratch it. I thought that by refusing the credits and ignoring the crowns, I was keeping my soul mine. I was wrong. Integrity isn't a trophy you keep for yourself. It's a tool you use to build something for everyone else. Looking back at that first collision in Bay 99, I see a man who was just as broken as Lyra's ship. I was redlining on cynicism, my internal shielding was fractured by old guilt, and I was drifting through the void with no destination. I helped her because she needed it, but I stayed with her because she showed me that a fair weld is the only thing that can bridge the gap between a queen and a ghost tech. We didn't just break a currency, we remembered how to value a human life without a decimal point. We learned that time isn't something you spend or save, it's something you inhabit. It's the sweat in your eyes when the manifold is leaking, the heat of the soldering iron on a cold deck plate, and the steady grip of a hand that doesn't want anything from you but your truth. My hands are still stained with grease, and my body is still wearing the scars of 70 star systems of trouble, but my soul has never felt cleaner. I've got 13 years left, and for the first time, I know exactly what they're worth. They're worth every second I spend making sure the next person who walks into my shop is treated like a person, not a line item. Because truth is the only thing that doesn't rust, and a job done well is the only way to say thank you to the universe for the breath in your lungs. I often wonder, as I sit here at my bench with the grease under my nails and the gears of the galaxy turning above me, if someone offered you 10 billion credits to change who you are, to trade your honesty for a paradise you didn't earn, would you have the courage to say standard rate and keep your soul? What is the one part of yourself that you would never ever sell, no matter how many zeros they added to the check? Jax Thorne picked up his hyperspanner, the silver metal catching the amber glow of the station's free-burning core, and turned back to the broken radiator on the wall. He began to whistle a low, rhythmic tune that perfectly matched the heartbeat of the station.